In the hushed elegance of Blackthorn Manor, where candlelight dances on polished silver and secrets whisper behind closed doors, a scream pierces the night. Eleanor Vane, radiant and betrothed, lies dead, poisoned, with a cryptic letter clutched in her hand. I know the truth now, and I cannot bear it. Was it suicide, as the police believe, or murder cloaked in deception? Who among the charming guests, her dashing fiancé, her loyal friend, the sharp-eyed novelist, or the quiet doctor, hides a deadly truth? Miss Jane Marple, with her unassuming smile and needle-sharp mind, arrives to unravel a web of lies where every glance holds a clue and every secret could kill. What did Eleanor know, and why did it cost her life? Chapter 1. The Invitation to Blackthorn Manor. The late afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the tidy lawns of St. Mary Mead, where the air held the crisp promise of autumn. In her modest cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, her sharp eyes occasionally darting to the garden, where a blackbird hopped among the roses. She was not, as one might assume, lost in idle thought. No, Miss Marple's mind was ever active, piecing together the subtle patterns of human behavior, much like the woolen scarf taking shape in her hands. The post had arrived earlier, bringing with it an elegant cream envelope embossed with the crest of Blackthorn Manor. Miss Marple had opened it with care, her curiosity piqued. The letter, written in a flowing, precise hand, was an invitation from Lady Beatrice Haverford, a widow of considerable means and impeccable reputation, to spend a weekend at her estate in the rolling hills of Devon. The occasion was to celebrate the engagement of Lady Beatrice's nephew, Charles Haverford, to Miss Eleanor Vane, a young woman of striking beauty and uncertain origins. The guest list promised a small but illustrious gathering: a retired colonel, a novelist of some renown, a distant cousin with a penchant for gambling, and a few others from the upper echelons of society. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her lips pursed thoughtfully. She had met Lady Beatrice once, years ago, at a charity bazaar in London. A kind woman, but proud, with a tendency to trust too readily in the goodness of others. The invitation, though gracious, carried an undercurrent of urgency. Your presence would be a comfort, Lady Beatrice had written, for I fear not all is as it seems. Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of observing the quiet dramas of village life, stirred. Something was amiss at Blackthorn Manor. The journey to Devon was uneventful, though the train's rhythmic clatter gave Miss Marple ample time to reflect. She arrived at Blackthorn Manor just as dusk settled, the manor's ivy-clad walls looming against a sky streaked with violet. The house was grand yet somber, its tall windows reflecting the fading light like watchful eyes. A butler, impeccably formal, greeted her at the door and led her to the drawing-room, where the other guests were already assembled. Lady Beatrice, dressed in widow's black softened by a lace shawl, rose to greet her.
"Miss Marple, how good of you to come," she said,
her voice warm but tinged with strain. Her eyes, though kind, betrayed a flicker of unease. Beside her stood Charles Haverford, a handsome man in his early 30s, with a charming smile that seemed a touch too practiced. Eleanor Vane, his fiancée, was a vision in pale blue silk, her dark hair swept up in a style that spoke of London sophistication. Yet her smile, Miss Marple noted, did not quite reach her eyes. The other guests were equally intriguing. Colonel Reginald Bantry, retired from the Indian Army, stood ramrod straight by the fireplace, his moustache bristling as he recounted tales of his campaigns. Mrs. Clara Wentworth, a novelist whose romantic tales had captivated the nation, sat poised with a glass of sherry, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Mr. Felix Langston, the distant cousin, lounged in a corner, his fingers drumming nervously on the arm of his chair, a faint flush suggesting he'd already visited the decanter more than once. Dr. Hugh Grayson, a quiet physician with a scholarly air, seemed content to listen rather than speak, while Miss Sylvia Trent, a young friend of Eleanor's,
fluttered about with a nervous energy that bordered on theatrical. Dinner was announced at precisely 7 o'clock, and the party moved to the dining room, where a long mahogany table gleamed under the light of a crystal chandelier. The meal was exquisite: roast pheasant, creamed potatoes, and a delicate consommé, but Miss Marple paid more attention to the guests than the food. She noted how Charles's hand lingered on Eleanor's as he passed her the salt, a gesture that seemed possessive rather than affectionate. She observed, too, the way Lady Beatrice's eyes darted toward Felix whenever he spoke, as if expecting him to say something untoward. Colonel Bantry's anecdotes grew louder with each glass of wine, while Mrs. Wentworth's polite smiles grew tighter, her pen poised over a small notebook, as if to capture some fleeting thought. Miss Marple, ever the unobtrusive observer, sipped her soup and listened. She noted the time, 7:15 p.m., when Felix excused himself briefly, claiming a need for fresh air. She saw Eleanor's quick glance at Sylvia, a look that held more than casual friendship, and she marked the moment when Dr. Grayson, adjusting his spectacles, dropped his napkin and bent to retrieve it, his movement slow and deliberate, as if he was studying the floor itself. The conversation turned to the engagement, and Lady Beatrice raised her glass. "To Charles and Eleanor," she said.
Response: his glass raised a fraction too late. By 8:30 p.m., as coffee was served in the drawing room, the atmosphere had grown subtly strained, like a violin string tightened to the point of snapping. It was then that Miss Marple noticed the small details that others overlooked. The faint smudge of ink on Mrs. Wentworth's cuff, suggesting a late-night letter or manuscript. The way Sylvia's bracelet, a gaudy thing of paste jewels, caught the light, drawing attention to her restless hands, and the curious fact that Colonel Bantry's watch was set 5 minutes slow, a detail he corrected with a muttered curse when he thought no one was watching. As the evening drew to a close, Lady Beatrice invited Miss Marple to her private sitting room for a quiet word. The room was cozy, with a fire crackling in the grate, and a portrait of the late Lord Haverford gazing sternly from above the mantel. "I'm so glad you're here," Lady Beatrice said, her voice low. "Charles is dear to me, but this engagement, it feels wrong. Eleanor is charming, but there's something I can't place. And Felix, he's been borrowing money again, I'm sure of it. I fear trouble is brewing." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her mind racing. "People are not always what they seem, Lady Beatrice," she said gently. "But rest assured, I shall observe closely. The truth has a way of revealing itself, given time." As she retired to her room, Miss Marple's thoughts were a tapestry of impressions. A glance, a gesture, a word out of place. Blackthorn Manor was a stage, and its players were hiding secrets. She did not yet know what form the drama would take, but she felt certain it would not be long before the curtain rose on something far darker than a celebration. Chapter 2: The Shadow Falls. The morning sun filtered through the heavy drapes of Blackthorn Manor, casting a soft glow over the breakfast room where the guests had gathered. The air was fragrant with the scent of fresh coffee and warm toast, but an undercurrent of unease lingered, as if the house itself held its breath. Miss Jane Marple, seated at the far end of the table, buttered her scone with deliberate care, her eyes flitting from one guest to another. She had slept lightly, her mind turning over the previous evening's impressions, the strained smiles, the guarded glances, the faint but unmistakable scent of secrets. The breakfast table was not fully occupied. Lady Beatrice, pale but composed, presided over the meal, her conversation polite but distracted. Charles Haverford, his charm undimmed, chatted animatedly with Colonel Bantry about the merits of pheasant shooting. Eleanor Vane, however, was absent, a fact that drew a murmured comment from Sylvia Trent, who suggested her friend might be feeling under the weather. Felix Langston, looking worse for wear, sipped his coffee in silence, his eyes bloodshot and his fingers twitching. Mrs. Clara Wentworth, the novelist, scribbled in her notebook between bites.
her expression one of detached amusement. Dr. Hugh Grayson, ever reserved, read the morning paper, though Miss Marple noted how his eyes lingered on the empty seat where Eleanor should have been. At precisely 9:15 a.m., as the grandfather clock in the hall chimed, the butler, Mr. Collins, entered with a grave expression. He leaned close to Lady Beatrice and whispered something that caused her to stiffen, her teacup clattering against its saucer. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to their hostess. "Excuse me," Lady Beatrice said, her voice trembling slightly. "I must attend to a matter. Please continue your breakfast." She rose and followed Collins from the room, leaving a ripple of curiosity in her wake. Miss Marple, her instinct sharpened by years of village gossip, sensed that something was gravely wrong. She excused herself, citing a need to fetch her shawl, and slipped into the corridor. From there she could hear hushed voices coming from the direction of the east wing, where the guest bedrooms were located. Moving with the quiet grace of a cat, she followed the sound, her soft shoes making no noise on the polished floor. The corridor led to a heavy oak door, slightly ajar, which opened into a small sitting room adjacent to Eleanor Vane's bedroom. Inside, Lady Beatrice stood with Collins and a maid, their faces ashen. On the floor, sprawled in an unnatural pose, lay Eleanor Vane. Her pale blue nightgown was crumpled, her dark hair fanned out like a halo, and her eyes stared blankly at the ceiling. A small glass vial, empty but for a faint residue, lay near her outstretched hand. The room smelled faintly of almonds, a detail that sent a chill through Miss Marble's heart. "Oh, heavens!" Lady Beatrice whispered, her hand pressed to her mouth. She's dead." Miss Marple stepped forward, her presence calm but authoritative. "Lady Beatrice, if I may," she said gently, "we must touch nothing until the police are called. Every detail matters." The maid, trembling, was sent to telephone the local constable, while Collins was instructed to ensure no one entered the room. Miss Marple, with Lady Beatrice's reluctant permission, took a moment to observe the scene. Eleanor's body lay near a writing desk, on which sat a half-finished letter, the ink still wet. The window was closed, its latch secure, ruling out an intruder from outside, at least for now. A delicate gold locket, its chain broken, lay near the vial, and a single rose petal, incongruously fresh, rested on the carpet beside the desk. By 10 a.m. the local police arrived, led by Inspector Harrow, a stout man with a no-nonsense demeanor. He surveyed the scene with a practiced eye, declaring it quietly to one side, raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. She noted the inspector's confidence, but her mind was already sifting through the details. The broken locket, the rose petal, the letter that seemed to have been interrupted mid-sentence. Suicide was possible, but Miss Marple had seen too many village tragedies to accept the obvious without question. People, she knew, were rarely so simple. The guests were summoned to the drawing room, where Inspector Harrow began his inquiries. Charles Haverford was the first to speak, his voice breaking as he described finding Eleanor's door locked the previous evening at 11 p.m., when he'd knocked to wish her good night. "She didn't answer," he said, his eyes red-rimmed. "I thought she was asleep." Sylvia Trent, tearful and clutching a handkerchief, claimed to have seen Eleanor at 10:30 p.m., when they'd shared a glass of sherry in the library. "She seemed perfectly fine," Sylvia insisted, though her voice wavered. "Perhaps a little quiet, but nothing to suggest this." Colonel Bantry, bristling with indignation, declared he'd been in his room by 10 p.m., reading military history and hearing nothing unusual. Mrs. Wentworth, her novelist eye gleaming, admitted to working late in her room, though she vaguely recalled hearing footsteps in the corridor around midnight. Felix Langston, visibly shaken, said he'd been in the billiard room until 11:30 p.m., playing a solitary game, and Dr. Grayson confirmed he'd retired early, around 9:45 p.m., after a headache prompted him to take a sleeping draught. Miss Marple listened, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression one of mild curiosity. She noted the times, the alibis, the slight hesitations in each account. She observed, too, the way Felix's fingers trembled as he spoke, and the way Mrs. Wentworth's eyes flicked towards Charles when he mentioned the locked door. Most curious of all was the rose petal, a detail that seemed out of place in a room otherwise pristine. As the inspector concluded his initial questioning, Miss Marple approached Lady Beatrice, who sat pale and shaken in a corner of the room. "My dear," Miss Marple said softly, "might I see Eleanor's room again? There are small things that interest me." Lady Beatrice nodded, too distraught to question her. Accompanied by Collins, Miss Marple returned to the scene, her eyes scanning every detail. The letter on the desk was addressed to "My dearest," but its contents were cryptic. "I know the truth now, and I cannot bear it. Forgive me." The ink was fresh, the pen still uncapped, suggesting Eleanor had been writing just before her death. The broken locket, when examined closely, revealed a tiny photograph inside. A man's face, too small to identify clearly. The rose petal, Miss Marple's mind was a whirl of possibilities. The inspector's talk of suicide was too tidy, too convenient. She recalled the guarded looks at dinner, the tension beneath the polite veneer. Someone in Blackthorn Manor knew more than they were saying, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover the truth, one subtle clue at a time. The morning wore on, the house heavy with grief and suspicion. Miss Marple returned to the drawing-room, her demeanor as serene as ever, but her thoughts were far from calm. A crime had been committed, and though the police might be satisfied with their theory, she was not. The rose petal, the locket, the letter, they were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple knew that puzzles, when solved, revealed the most surprising truths. The morning at Blackthorn Manor had taken on a hushed oppressive quality, as if the very walls mourned the tragedy that had unfolded within them. By 11:30 a.m., the police had cordoned off Eleanor Vane's room, and Inspector Harrow was busy taking statements in the library, his brisk efficiency contrasting sharply with the subdued mood of the household. Miss Jane Marple, however, sat quietly in a corner of the drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking softly, her eyes as bright and attentive as a sparrow's. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly spinster, absorbed in her wool and her thoughts, but those who knew her understood that Miss Marple missed nothing. The guests, scattered about the room, were restless. Charles Haverford paced near the window, his hands clasped behind his back, his face a mask of grief that seemed, to Miss Marple's discerning eye, just a shade too theatrical. Lady Beatrice, seated on a velvet settee, twisted a lace handkerchief in her hands, her eyes darting toward the door each time footsteps echoed in the hall. Colonel Bantry, his military bearing intact, stood by the fireplace, polishing his monocle with unnecessary vigour. Mrs. Clara Wentworth, the novelist, continued to jot notes in her little book, her expression one of detached curiosity, as if she was studying characters for her next novel. Felix Langston, slumped in an armchair, stared into his empty coffee cup, while Sylvia Trent, pale and tearful, clutched a cushion as if it were a lifeline. Dr. Hugh Grayson, ever the silent observer, sat apart, his scholarly face unreadable behind his spectacles. Miss Marple's presence, unobtrusive as it was, seemed to go unnoticed by most, which suited her perfectly. She had not been summoned by the police, nor had she been invited to Blackthorn Manor as a detective. Yet Lady Beatrice's cryptic words, "I fear not all is as it seems," had planted a seed, and the discovery of Eleanor's body had confirmed her suspicions. A cry, "Miss Marple," she said in a low voice, "might you walk with me in the garden? I feel I shall go mad if I stay indoors another moment." Miss Marple folded her knitting and rose with a gentle smile. "Of course, my dear. A breath of fresh air will do us both good." The garden of Blackthorn Manor was a study in orderly beauty, with neatly trimmed hedges and rose beds arranged in precise patterns. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and fading blooms. As they strolled along a gravel path, Lady Beatrice spoke in a rush, as if unburdening herself of a weight she could no longer carry. "I cannot believe Eleanor took her own life," she said, her voice trembling. "She was so full of vitality, so eager for her future with Charles, and yet there was something about her, a shadow I couldn't quite place. She was secretive, Miss Marple. I once overheard her speaking to Sylvia in hushed tones. Something about a debt that must be paid. I thought little of it at the time, but now—" Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic but her mind alert. "People often hide their troubles behind a smile," she said softly. "Tell me, Lady Beatrice, did Eleanor have any enemies? Anyone who might have wished her harm?" Lady Beatrice hesitated, her fingers tightening on her handkerchief. "I shouldn't like to speak ill of anyone, but Felix, he was not fond of her. He told me once that Eleanor was not what she seemed, though he wouldn't elaborate. And Charles, well, he adored her, but there were moments when I sensed tension. Small things, you understand. A glance, a word spoken too sharply." Miss Marple made a mental note of these observations, filing them away like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. "And the other guests?" she asked. "Mrs. Wentworth, for instance, or Dr. Grayson?" "Clara Wentworth is a dear friend, but she's terribly observant, always watching people as if they're characters in one of her novels. As for Dr. Grayson, he's quiet, almost too quiet. He was Eleanor's physician in London, you know. I believe he treated her for nerves some months ago." Lady Beatrice paused, then added, "Colonel Bantry, of course, is all bluster, but he's harmless. Sylvia, poor child, is devastated. She and Eleanor were inseparable." They paused by a stone bench, and Miss Marple sat, her eyes scanning the garden. She noted a gardener in the distance, pruning a hedge with meticulous care, and a faint trail of cigarette ash near the path, an oddity in such a pristine setting. "And the household staff?" she asked. "Are they all trustworthy?" Lady Beatrice frowned. "Collins has been with us for years, utterly loyal. The maids are local girls, dependable enough. There's a new footman, Thomas, but he seems diligent. I can't imagine any of them involved in this." Broken locket. These were threads in a tapestry she had yet to fully discern. She thanked Lady Beatrice and suggested they return to the house, where Inspector Harrow was concluding his morning's work. In the library, the inspector was addressing the guests, his tone authoritative. "We've sent the vial and other evidence to the laboratory," he said. "Preliminary findings confirm cyanide poisoning, likely self-administered. The letter found on the desk suggests Miss Vane was in distress. We'll need to verify alibis, of course, but for now, I ask that no one leave the manor without permission." A murmur of unease rippled through the room. Charles Haverford protested, his voice sharp. "This is absurd. Eleanor would never have taken her own life. She had everything to live for." "Grief can cloud judgment," Inspector Harrow said, not unkindly. "But we must consider all possibilities." Miss Marple, standing quietly by the door, observed the reactions. Sylvia's sobs grew louder, drawing sympathetic glances from Dr. Grayson. Felix's face was pale, his hands clenched. Mrs. Wentworth's pen paused, her eyes narrowing as she studied Charles. Colonel Bantry muttered something about damned police inefficiency, while Lady Beatrice looked as if she might faint. As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes falling on a small detail she had missed earlier, a faint scratch on the library table, near where Sylvia had been sitting the previous evening. It was barely noticeable, but it suggested something had been dragged across the surface, a key, perhaps, or a piece of jewelry. She filed this away along with the other fragments of the puzzle. That afternoon, Miss Marple requested permission to speak with the maid who had discovered Eleanor's body. The girl, Mary, was nervous but forthcoming. "I went to Miss Vane's room at 9 this morning, ma'am," she said, twisting her apron. "The door was unlocked, which was odd because she always locked it at night. I saw her lying there and I screamed. That's when Mr. Collins came running." "Unlocked, you say?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle, encouraging. "And did you notice anything else? A sound, a smell, anything out of place?" Mary hesitated. "There was a queer smell, like bitter almonds, and I think I saw a shadow move in the corridor just before I went in, but it might have been my imagination, ma'am." Miss Marple thanked her and made her way to the hall, where the vase of roses stood. She examined the blooms closely, noting that one stem was slightly shorter than the others, as if a petal had been plucked. It was a small thing, but in Miss Marple's experience, small things often led to great revelations. As the day drew to a close, the manor seemed to settle into an uneasy quiet. Miss Marple retired to her room, her mind a whirl of observations. The unlocked door, the shadow in the corridor, the scratched table, a whisper of the truth. Eleanor Vane's death was no suicide, of that she was certain. Someone in Blackthorn Manor had orchestrated a crime, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, would uncover it. One delicate thread at a time. Chapter 4. The Questions Begin. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Blackthorn Manor, casting intricate patterns on the polished floor of the library, where Miss Jane Marple had settled with a cup of tea. The room, lined with leather-bound volumes and heavy oak furniture, exuded an air of quiet authority, but the atmosphere was anything but serene. The guests, confined to the manor by Inspector Harrow's orders, moved restlessly about, their polite facades fraying under the weight of suspicion. Miss Marple, her knitting resting in her lap, appeared to be merely a gentle old lady enjoying a moment of repose, but her sharp eyes missed nothing, and her mind was a hive of activity, sorting through the threads of the tragedy that had unfolded. Inspector Harrow had concluded his morning interviews and was now in the village, consulting with the coroner about the preliminary autopsy results. This left Miss Marple with an opportunity to pursue her own inquiries, not as an official detective, but as a guest whose curiosity was tempered by a disarming air of innocence. She had already decided to speak with each of the guests, for she knew that the truth often lay not in grand gestures, but in the small inconsistencies of human behavior, those fleeting glances, those unguarded words that betrayed the heart's secrets. Her first conversation was with Sylvia Trent, who sat alone in the conservatory, her delicate frame hunched over a cup of untouched tea. Sylvia's eyes were red from crying, and her fingers twisted a damp handkerchief. Miss Marple approached with a gentle smile, settling into a wicker chair beside her. "My dear," she said softly, "I know this is a dreadful time, but might I have a word? I find it helps to talk sometimes when the heart is heavy." Sylvia nodded, her expression wary. "Of course, Miss Marple. It's just, I can't believe Eleanor is gone. She was my dearest friend." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was alert. "You were very close, I understand. Tell me, when you saw her last night in the library,
Did she seem herself? You mentioned she was a little quiet. Sylvia hesitated, her fingers tightening on the handkerchief. She was. Distracted, perhaps. We talked about the engagement, about her plans with Charles. She said she was happy, but there was something in her voice, a strain, I thought. I asked if anything was wrong, but she just smiled and changed the subject. Sylvia's gaze dropped to her lap. I wish I'd pressed her. Miss Marple noted the hesitation, the way Sylvia's eyes flickered away. And this was at 10:30 p.m., you said. Did anyone else?
Briefly, looking for a book. But he left almost at once. He seemed in a foul mood. Sylvia's voice held a trace of disdain, and Miss Marple made a mental note of it. After a few more gentle questions, Miss Marple thanked Sylvia and moved on, her next target being Charles Haverford. She found him in the billiard room, idly rolling a cue ball across the green baize, his face etched with grief, or so it appeared. "Mr. Haverford," she said, her tone warm but inquiring, "might I trouble you for a moment? I find myself quite at a loss about poor Miss Fane, and I thought you, being so close to her, might shed some light." Charles straightened, his charm reasserting itself like a well-worn mask. "Of course, Miss Marple, anything to help. I'm still in shock, you know. Eleanor was everything to me." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression sympathetic. "It must be dreadful. You mentioned her door was locked at 11 p.m. when you knocked. Did you hear anything at all? A sound, perhaps, or a voice?" Charles shook his head, his eyes meeting hers briefly before darting away. "Nothing. It was quiet. I assumed she was asleep, if only I'd insisted on seeing her." His voice broke, but Miss Marple noted the slight clenching of his jaw, as if he were holding something back. "And your engagement," she continued, her tone light. "It was a happy one, I presume. No little disagreements, as young couples sometimes have?" Charles's smile was tight. "Oh, we had our moments, but nothing serious. Eleanor was spirited, you see. She had her own mind, but that's what I loved about her." He paused, then added almost too quickly, "We were planning a life together, in London, after the wedding." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes lingering on the way his fingers gripped the cue ball. She thanked him and moved on, her thoughts turning to the other guests. Colonel Bantry was next, found in the garden, inspecting a rosebush with a critical eye. His military bluster softened slightly under Miss Marple's gentle questioning, but his alibi remained firm. He'd been in his room by 10 p.m., reading, and had heard nothing unusual. Yet Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in his hand as he adjusted his monocle, a sign of nerves that belied his confident demeanor. Mrs. Clara Wentworth proved a more challenging subject. The novelist, seated at a writing desk in the drawing-room, greeted Miss Marple with a cool smile. "I suppose you're playing detective, Miss Marple," she said, her tone teasing, but her eyes sharp. "I've written enough mysteries to know a sleuth when I see one." Miss Marple chuckled softly, deflecting the remark. "Merely an old lady's curiosity, Mrs. Wentworth. You were up late last night, I believe, working on your manuscript. Did you hear anything unusual? Perhaps around midnight?" Specific, I'm afraid. I was rather absorbed in my work." She hesitated, then added, "Eleanor was a fascinating character, you know. I've been studying her for my next book. A woman with secrets, I thought." Miss Marple's interest piqued, but she kept her tone mild. "Secrets, you say? Anything in particular?" "Oh, nothing concrete," Mrs. Wentworth said airily. "Just a novelist's intuition. She had a certain guardedness, as if she were playing a role. But then, don't we all?" Her smile was enigmatic, and Miss Marple noted the ink smudge on her cuff, a detail that suggested more than casual note-taking. Dr. Hugh Grayson was the last to be questioned, found in the study, poring over a medical journal. His reserved demeanor softened under Miss Marple's gentle probing,
and he confirmed treating Eleanor for nerves in London some months ago. She was under strain, he said carefully, but nothing to suggest this. I prescribed a mild sedative, nothing more. And last night, Miss Marple asked, you retired early, I believe, with a sleeping draught? Yes, around 9:45 p.m., he said, adjusting his spectacles. I heard nothing, saw nothing. I'm afraid I'm not much help. His tone was steady, but Miss Marple noticed the way his fingers lingered on the journal's pages, as if anchoring himself. As the interviews concluded, Miss Marple returned to the library, her mind a tapestry of impressions. Sylvia's hesitation, Charles's guardedness, the Colonel's tremor, Mrs. Wentworth's cryptic remarks, Dr. Grayson's reticence, was a clue, however small. She recalled the maid's mention of a shadow in the corridor, the rose petal in Eleanor's room, the broken locket with its tiny photograph. And then there was the scratch on the library table, a mark that suggested something had been moved, perhaps a key, or the locket itself. By 4 p.m. the manor was steeped in a heavy silence, broken only by the distant ticking of the grandfather clock. Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting needles moving rhythmically, her thoughts far from idle. The police might believe Eleanor's death was suicide, but Miss Marple saw contradictions. The unlocked door, the fresh ink on the letter, the rose petal that matched the hall's vase. Someone in Blackthorn Manor had orchestrated a crime, exploiting the kindness of those who trusted too readily. Miss Marple's task was to find the thread that would unravel the truth, and she would not rest until she had. The late afternoon at Blackthorn Manor was cloaked in a heavy stillness, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves outside and the distant murmur of the police officers stationed at the front gate. By 4:30 p.m., Inspector Harrow had returned from the village, his expression grim as he gathered the guests in the drawing room to share the coroner's preliminary.
With her knitting, observed the scene with her characteristic blend of quiet attentiveness and deceptive mildness. Her needles clicked softly, a steady rhythm that belied the sharp workings of her mind as she sifted through the web of half-truths and hidden motives that enveloped the manor. Inspector Harrow stood by the fireplace, his notebook open, his tone authoritative. The coroner confirms cyanide poisoning as the cause of Miss Vane's death, he announced. The vial found near her body contained traces of the substance, and the letter on her desk suggests a state of despair. However, we've uncovered additional evidence that complicates matters. He paused, his eyes scanning the room, lingering on Felix Langston, who sat slumped in an armchair, his face pale and his hands unsteady. Miss Marple noted the inspector's focus, her own gaze flitting to Felix. The young man's disheveled appearance and nervous demeanor had not escaped her notice, and she sensed that the inspector was about to cast him as the prime suspect, a classic red herring, she thought, for those who failed to look beyond the obvious. We've learned, Inspector Harrow continued, that Mr. Langston had a heated exchange with Miss Vane 2 days ago, overheard by one of the maids. It seems there was a matter of money, a substantial sum that Miss Vane refused to lend him. Furthermore, a small bottle, similar to the one found in Miss Vane's room, was discovered in Mr. Langston's luggage during a routine search this afternoon. A gasp rippled through the room. Charles Haverford leapt to his feet, his face flushed with anger. "That's preposterous! Felix may be a fool with money, but he's no murderer." Lady Beatrice, seated beside him, clutched her handkerchief, her eyes wide with distress. Sylvia Trent let out a small sob while Mrs. Clara Wentworth's pen paused over her notebook, her lips curling into a faint, enigmatic smile. Felix, for his part, looked as if he might bolt from the room. "This is absurd," he stammered, his voice cracking. "Yes, I asked Eleanor for a loan. She was my cousin's fiancée after all, but I never threatened her, and that bottle, I've never seen it before in my life." Inspector Harrow raised a hand for silence. "We'll need to question you further, Mr. Langston. For now, I ask that you remain in the manor and cooperate fully." As the inspector turned to confer with the constable, Miss Marple's mind was already at work, dissecting the new information. Felix's financial troubles were no surprise. Lady Beatrice had hinted at his gambling debts, and his nervous demeanor at dinner had suggested a man under pressure. The bottle in his luggage was damning, yet Miss Marple's instincts told her it was too convenient, too neatly placed to be the work of a careful criminal. In her experience, the truth was rarely so obliging as to present itself in such a tidy package. She decided to test the waters.
Approaching Felix as the guests dispersed. "Mr. Langston," she said gently, her tone that of a kindly aunt, "this must be terribly distressing for you. Might I ask about your conversation with Miss Vane? I find that small details often clarify matters." Felix ran a hand through his hair, his eyes darting nervously. "It was nothing, really. I asked her for a loan, £500 to settle a debt. She refused, said she didn't have that kind of money to spare. I was annoyed, yes, but I wouldn't—" His voice trailed off, and Miss Marple noted the beads of sweat on his brow. "And when was this?" she asked, her voice soft but probing. "2 days ago, in the garden," he said, "around noon. The maid must have overheard us. She was pruning nearby. But I swear, Miss Marple, I had nothing to do with her death." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic, but her mind cataloguing every word. The maid's testimony corroborated Felix's account, but it also placed him in a compromising position. She thanked him and moved on, her thoughts turning to the other guests, each of whom might have reason to obscure the truth. Her next encounter was with Mrs. Clara Wentworth, who was lingering in the hall, her notebook tucked under her arm. The novelist's sharp eyes met Miss Marple's, and she smiled faintly. "You're quite the observer, Miss Marple," she said. "I've been watching you, you know. You see more than you let on." Miss Marple chuckled, deflecting the remark with her usual modesty. "An old lady's habit, Mrs. Wentworth. I find people so interesting. You, for instance, must see a great deal writing your novels. Did you notice anything unusual about Miss Vane? Perhaps something that didn't make it into your notes?" Mrs. Wentworth's smile tightened. "Eleanor was complex. She had a way of charming people while keeping them at a distance. I saw her arguing with Sylvia in the library the other day, not loudly, but intensely. Something about a promise not kept. I didn't catch the details, but it struck me as odd, given how close they seemed." Miss Marple filed this away, her mind returning to Sylvia's tearful account of her last meeting with Eleanor. An argument, however quiet, suggested a fracture in their friendship, a fracture that might hold a clue. She thanked Mrs. Wentworth and made her way to the conservatory, where Sylvia was now joined by Dr. Hugh Grayson, who was offering her a glass of water and speaking in low, soothing tones. "Miss Trent," Miss Marple said, approaching with her usual gentleness, "I wonder if you might clarify something for me. Mrs. Wentworth mentioned seeing you and Miss Vane in a discussion the other day in the library. It seemed rather serious. Might you tell me what it was about?" Sylvia's face paled, and she glanced at Dr. Grayson, who gave her an encouraging nod. "It was nothing, really," she said, trembling. "Just a silly misunderstanding. Eleanor had promised to help me with a personal matter, but she changed her mind. We sorted it out, I promise." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on Sylvia's trembling hands, noting the way Dr. Grayson's hand rested briefly on her shoulder, a gesture that seemed more protective than professional. "And this was when?" she asked. "3 days ago, in the afternoon," Sylvia said. "Around 3 p.m., I think. It was nothing serious, Miss Marple, truly." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over the new information. The library seemed to be a nexus of secrets. Sylvia and Eleanor's argument, Felix's brief appearance the night of the murder, the scratched table. She made a mental note
to examine the room more closely later. As evening approached, the manor grew quieter, the guests retreating to their rooms or gathering in small, tense groups. Miss Marple slipped into the library, her eyes scanning the scene. The scratched table caught her attention again, and she bent to examine it, noting a faint residue of wax near the mark, as if a candle had been moved. She recalled the cigarette ash in the garden, the rose petal in Eleanor's room, the broken locket with its tiny photograph. Each was a piece of the puzzle, and while Felix Langston's predicament pointed an accusing finger, Miss Marple suspected the truth lay elsewhere. The inspector's focus on Felix was understandable, but Miss Marple knew better than to trust the obvious. Someone had placed that bottle in his luggage, she was certain, just as someone had left the vial in Eleanor's room. The question was, who and why? As she left the library, her thoughts were a tapestry of suspicions, each thread leading to a different guest, a different motive. The red herrings were plentiful, but Miss Marple's little grey cells, as she might have called them in a moment of private whimsy, were already at work, untangling the lies from the truth. Chapter 6. A Clue in Detail. The second morning at Blackthorn Manor dawned grey and heavy, with a fine mist cloaking the Devon hills and lending the estate an air of quiet foreboding. Inside, the atmosphere was no less oppressive, the guests moving through their routines with the strained politeness of those under suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, seated at the breakfast table with a cup of tea and a piece of dry toast, appeared as serene as ever, her knitting tucked neatly beside her. Yet her eyes, bright and unyielding, darted from one guest to another, cataloguing every gesture, every word, every fleeting expression that might betray a hidden truth. Inspector Harrow had returned early, his notebook brimming with new details from the coroner's report.
Convinced. The evidence against Felix was too convenient, too meekly arranged, and she had learned long ago that truth was really so obliging. Her mind was fixed on the small details, the rose petal, the broken locket, the scratched table, the wax residue, that whispered of a more intricate plot. As the guests dispersed after breakfast, Miss Marple decided to revisit Eleanor Vane's room, with Lady Beatrice's reluctant permission. The police had concluded their initial examination, leaving the room cordoned off but accessible to a trusted guest like Miss Marple, whose unassuming presence disarmed even the sternest authority. She entered quietly, her soft shoes making no sound on the polished floor, and closed the door behind her. The room was as it had been, save for the absence of Eleanor's body, which had been taken to the village morgue. The writing desk, the empty vial, the broken locket, and the rose petal remained, each a silent witness to the tragedy. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the desk, where the half-finished letter still lay, its ink now dry, but its words as cryptic as ever. I know the truth now, and I cannot bear it. Forgive me. She examined the pen, noting its fine nib and the faint smudge of ink on the blotter. The letter was addressed to "My Dearest," a term that could apply to Charles, Sylvia, or someone else entirely. Miss Marple's mind turned to the locket, which she had been permitted to inspect more closely. The tiny photograph inside was blurred, but it depicted a man with dark hair and a strong jaw, possibly Charles, though the image was too small to be certain. It was then that she noticed something new, a faint mark on the desk's edge, barely visible unless one looked closely. It was a small, circular indentation, as if something heavy had been placed there briefly
and then removed. Miss Marple bent closer, her eyes narrowing. The mark was accompanied by a trace of wax, similar to that found on the library table. She recalled Mrs. Wentworth's mention of working late by candlelight and the residue she had seen near the scratched table. The connection was tenuous, but it suggested a sequence of events that did not align with the official timeline. Miss Marple straightened, her mind racing. The wax was a clue, an inconsistency that pointed to movement within the house at a time when most claimed to be asleep or occupied. She decided to test this theory by examining the library again, where the scratched table and wax residue had first caught her attention. Slipping downstairs, she found the room empty, the heavy silence broken only by the ticking of a mantel clock. The table, positioned near the window, bore the same shade as the gown Eleanor had worn at dinner on the night of her death. Miss Marple's lips pursed thoughtfully. The thread suggested that Eleanor had been in the library that night, perhaps after her meeting with Sylvia at 10:30 p.m. But Charles had claimed her door was locked at 11 p.m., and Sylvia had insisted their conversation was uneventful. The thread, the wax, the rose petal. These were not random details, but pieces of a puzzle that pointed to a different narrative. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple sought out Lady Beatrice, who was arranging flowers in a vase, her hands trembling slightly. "Lady Beatrice," Miss Marple said gently, "might I ask about the candles used in the house? I noticed some wax in the library, and it struck me as curious." Lady Beatrice looked surprised, but answered readily. "We use beeswax candles, Miss Marple, though they're rarely needed with the electric lights. The maids keep them in the pantry, but I believe Mrs. Wentworth requested one for her room, as she prefers writing by candlelight. She says it inspires her." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing this detail. "And the roses in the hall vase, do they come from the garden?" "Yes, the gardener cuts them fresh each morning," Lady Beatrice said. "They're a particular variety, quite distinctive. Why do you ask?" "Oh, just an old lady's curiosity," Miss Marple replied with a smile, but her thoughts were far from idle. The rose petal in Eleanor's room matched the hall vase, and the wax in both the library and Eleanor's room suggested movement, perhaps someone carrying a candle between the two locations. Mrs. Wentworth's habit of writing by candlelight was interesting, but so was the fact that the library table's scratch and the desk's indentation both bore traces of wax. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple decided to speak with Dr. Hugh Grayson, whose reserved demeanor had intrigued her. She found him in the study, reading a medical text, his spectacles glinting in the dim light. "Dr. Grayson," she said, settling into a chair opposite him, "you mentioned treating Miss Vane for nerves. Might I ask if she ever spoke of her fears or worries? Sometimes a patient confides in their doctor." Dr. Grayson hesitated, his fingers pausing on the page. "She was under strain, as I said," he replied carefully. "She mentioned feeling watched, as if someone were keeping an eye on her. I attributed it to her nerves, but now I wonder if there was more to it." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her expression remained mild. "Watched, you say? Did she name anyone?" "No, she was vague," Dr. Grayson said, adjusting his spectacles. "But she did mention a letter she'd received, something that upset. It'd been a response to this mysterious letter, or something else entirely." She thanked Dr. Grayson and left the study, her thoughts a whirl of connections. The blue thread, the wax, the rose petal, the letter. Each pointed to a sequence of events that contradicted the alibis given. Someone had been in the library, after 10:30 p.m., and someone had been in Eleanor's room before her door was supposedly locked at 11 p.m. As evening approached, the manor settled into an uneasy quiet, the guests retreating to their rooms or gathering in tense silence. Miss Marple sat by the drawing-room window, her knitting needles moving rhythmically, her mind piecing together the puzzle. The wax and the thread were not mere coincidences. They were evidence of movement, of a plan carefully executed. Felix Langston might be the inspector's suspect, but Miss Marple knew the truth lay deeper, hidden in the subtle contradictions of human behavior. She would continue to observe, to question, to listen, until the pieces fell into place and the murderer's identity was revealed. Chapter 7. More Lies Surface. The third day at Blackthorn Manor was cloaked in a persistent drizzle, the gray sky mirroring the heavy mood within the house. The guests, still confined by Inspector Harrow's orders, moved through the grand rooms with a growing sense of unease, their conversations stilted and their glances wary. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the morning room with her knitting, appeared as serene as ever, her needles clicking in a steady rhythm that belied the sharp activity of her mind. She had spent the previous day gathering threads of the mystery, the wax residue, the blue silk thread, the rose petal, the cryptic letter, and now she sensed that the fabric of deceit was beginning to fray, revealing glimpses of the truth beneath. Inspector Harrow, fortified by the coroner's final report, had doubled down on Felix Langston as the prime suspect, citing the bottle in his luggage and his financial desperation as motive. Yet Miss Marple, with her quiet certainty, knew that the truth was more complex. The clues she had uncovered suggested a web of motives far beyond a simple loan refused, and she was determined to probe deeper, to uncover the hidden affairs and bitter feuds that simmered beneath the manor's polished surface. Her opportunity came at mid-morning, when she overheard a heated exchange in the conservatory. The voices belonged to Sylvia Trent and Charles Haverford, their tones low but intense, carried through the half-open door. Miss Marple, with the discretion of long practice, paused near the doorway, her knitting in hand, her presence unnoticed. "You should have told me, Sylvia," Charles was saying, his voice sharp with accusation. "If I'd known about the letters—"
"Never thought it would come to this." Miss Marple's ears pricked at the mention of letters, plural, unlike the single letter Dr. Grayson had referenced. She made a mental note to pursue this further, but before she could slip away, the conversation ended abruptly, and Sylvia emerged, her face pale and her eyes red. She started at the sight of Miss Marple, but managed a weak smile. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't see you there. I was just getting some air." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, her expression one of kindly concern. "This is a trying time for us all. If you ever wish to talk, I'm here." Sylvia nodded, her lips trembling, and hurried away. Miss Marple lingered, her thoughts turning to Charles. His mention of letters suggested a secret he shared with Sylvia, one that might shed light on Eleanor's death. She decided to seek him out, but first she turned her attention to another thread, the financial motives Lady Beatrice had hinted at. At noon, Miss Marple found Lady Beatrice in the drawing-room, sorting through a stack of correspondence with a distracted air. "Lady Beatrice," Miss Marple said, settling beside her, "I hope I'm not intruding. I've been thinking about poor Mr. Langston and his troubles. You mentioned his debts. Might I ask if they were significant?" Lady Beatrice sighed, setting down a letter. "Oh, Miss Marple, Felix has always been reckless with money. Gambling mostly, cards, horses, that sort of thing. He came to me last month,
asking for a loan of £2,000 to settle a debt to a rather unsavoury gentleman in London. I refused, of course. I've bailed him out too many times. But then he went to Eleanor, and, well, you know how that turned out."
Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the figure. £2,000, far more than the 500 Felix had admitted to requesting from Eleanor. The discrepancy suggested he was hiding the true extent of his troubles, or perhaps someone else had a stake in his financial ruin. And was there anyone else who might have had financial dealings with Miss Vane? She asked delicately. Lady Beatrice hesitated, her fingers tightening on her pen. "Well, there's Clara, Mrs. Wentworth. She and Eleanor were acquaintances in London, and I once overheard them discussing an investment, something about a publishing venture. Clara was quite insistent, but Eleanor seemed reluctant. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now—" This was new, and Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Mrs. Wentworth, with her novelist's eye and cryptic remarks, had already piqued her curiosity. A financial motive, even a minor one, could be significant. She thanked Lady Beatrice and made her way to the library, where she found Mrs. Wentworth seated at the scratched table, her notebook open and her pen moving swiftly across the page.
"Craft, even in such trying times. I understand you and Miss Vane were involved in a publishing venture together." Mrs. Wentworth's pen paused, and her eyes narrowed slightly. "You've been talking to Beatrice, I see," she said, her voice smooth but guarded. "It was nothing serious, just a discussion about funding a new literary magazine. Eleanor had some money from an inheritance, and I thought she might invest. She declined, and that was that." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes gentle but probing. "And this was when, exactly?" "Oh, a few weeks ago in London," Mrs. Wentworth said airily. "We met for tea at Claridge's. She was quite firm about keeping her money for her future with Charles." Miss Marple noted the casual dismissal, the way Mrs. Wentworth's fingers tightened on her pen. A financial disagreement, even a small one, could fester, especially for someone as observant and ambitious as the novelist. She thanked her and left, her thoughts turning to the bitter feud Sylvia's conversation with Charles had hinted at. That afternoon, Miss Marple sought out Colonel Bantry, whose military bluster had begun to seem like a shield for something deeper. She found him in the billiard room, polishing his cue with unnecessary vigor. "Colonel Bantry," she said, her tone warm, "I've so enjoyed your stories of India. I wonder, did you know Miss Vane well? I understand she spent time in London society, where you must have many acquaintances." The Colonel's moustache twitched, and he set the cue down with a clatter. "Not well, no," he said gruffly. "Met her a few times at social functions. Bit of a flirt, if you ask me. Didn't care for her much, too modern for my taste. And she had a way of stirring up trouble, especially with that Langston fellow. Saw them arguing once in London at a club. Something about a bet gone wrong." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her expression remained mild. "A bet, you say? When was this?" "Month or so ago," the Colonel said, his tone dismissive. "Didn't catch the details, but Langston looked ready to throttle her. Not surprised he's in hot water now." This corroborated Felix's financial troubles, but added a new layer, a personal animosity with Eleanor that went beyond a refused loan. Miss Marple thanked the Colonel and moved on, her mind a whirl of connections. The letters Sylvia and Charles had mentioned, the financial disputes involving Felix and Mrs. Wentworth, the feud hinted at by the Colonel, each was a thread in the tapestry of deceit. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by the drawing-room fire, her knitting needles moving rhythmically. The lies were surfacing, as she had expected, but they were tangled, each guest hiding their own secrets. Sylvia's secrecy about the letters, Charles's evasiveness, Mrs. Wentworth's guarded ambition, the Colonel's veiled hostility, Felix's desperate picture
remained incomplete. The wax residue, the blue thread, the rose petal, the locket, these clues pointed to a truth that was both intricate and deliberate. Miss Marple knew that the next revelation would bring her closer to the heart of the mystery, and she was prepared to wait, to watch, to listen until the murderer's mask slipped at last. Chapter 8. The Emotional Turning Point. The drizzle that had cloaked Blackthorn Manor for much of the morning gave way to a pale, reluctant sun by late afternoon, casting long shadows across the polished floors and heavy drapes. The house, however, remained steeped in tension, its inhabitants moving like actors in a play where the script had taken a dark and unexpected turn. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the morning room with her knitting, observed the guests with her usual quiet attentiveness, her needles clicking in a rhythm that seemed to steady the very air around her. Yet her mind was far from calm, weaving together the threads of the mystery, the wax residue, the blue silk thread, the rose petal, the broken locket, the cryptic letters that pointed to a truth hidden beneath layers of deceit. Inspector Harrow, still convinced of Felix Langston's guilt, had spent the morning questioning the staff about the bottle found in Felix's luggage, his brusque manner doing little to ease the manor's strained atmosphere. Miss Marple, however, had been pursuing her own inquiries, her gentle questions and unassuming presence coaxing out fragments of truth that the police had overlooked. She sensed that the web of lies was fraying, and today she felt certain someone would break under the weight of their secrets. Her opportunity came unexpectedly, shortly after lunch, when Sylvia Trent, pale and trembling, sought her out in the conservatory. The young woman's eyes were red-rimmed, her hands clutching a crumpled handkerchief as she sank into a wicker chair beside Miss Marple. "I can't bear it any longer," Sylvia whispered, her voice barely audible. "I have to tell someone, Miss Marple, or I'll go mad." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her expression one of gentle concern. "My dear," she said softly, "whatever it is, you may tell me. Sometimes sharing a burden makes it lighter." Sylvia's lips trembled, and for a moment she seemed on the verge of tears. Then, in a rush, the words spilled out. "Eleanor was being blackmailed, Miss Marple. She told me a week ago in confidence. Someone was sending her letters, horrible, threatening letters, demanding money to keep a secret from her past. She wouldn't tell me what it was, only that it could ruin her engagement to Charles. I begged her to go to the police, but she was terrified. She said she'd handle it herself." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her demeanor remained calm. "Blackmail, you say? Did she ever mention who might be behind it?" Sylvia shook her head, her voice breaking. "No, but she was so frightened, Miss Marple. The night she died, when we were in the library, she showed me one of the letters. It was typed, no signature, but it mentioned a meeting at midnight. She said she had to go to put an end to it. I tried to stop her, but she wouldn't listen. And now she's gone, and it's my fault for not doing more." Sylvia dissolved into sobs, and Miss Marple patted her hand gently, her mind racing. A blackmail letter, a midnight meeting. These were pieces that fit with the clues she had gathered. The wax residue suggesting movement in the night, the blue thread indicating Eleanor's presence in the library, the rose petal, perhaps, plucked in a moment of distraction. But Sylvia's revelation raised new questions. Who was the blackmailer, and what secret had Eleanor been so desperate to protect? "Do you still have the letter she showed you?" Miss Marple asked, her tone gentle but probing. Sylvia shook her head. "No, she took it with her. She said she'd burn it after the meeting." "Oh, Miss Marple, if I'd only insisted she tell Charles or Lady Beatrice." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to the letter found on Eleanor's desk. "I know the truth now, and I cannot bear it." Had it been a response to the blackmailer's demands, or something else entirely? She comforted Sylvia as best she could, urging her to rest, then made her way to the drawing room, where the other guests were gathered in uneasy silence. Charles Haverford stood by the window, his face drawn, while Lady Beatrice sat with a cup of tea, her hands trembling slightly. Colonel Bantry was polishing his monocle with unnecessary vigor, and Mrs. Clara Wentworth, as ever, scribbled in her notebook, her eyes darting about the room. Dr. Hugh Grayson sat apart, his scholarly air undisturbed, though Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tightened on his book when Sylvia's name was mentioned. Determined to probe further, Miss Marple approached Charles, her tone mild but purposeful. "Mr. Haverford," she said, "I understand this is a difficult time, but I've heard something troubling. Miss Trent mentioned that Eleanor was receiving threatening letters. Did she ever confide in you about such matters?" Charles's face paled, and for a moment he seemed at a loss. "Letters?" he said, his voice unsteady. She mentioned something about an old acquaintance who was bothering her, but she didn't give details. I thought it was nothing serious, just someone from her past, perhaps a jealous suitor. I told her to ignore it." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her smile remained gentle. "And you didn't think to inquire further? A young woman in distress, surely, would turn to her fiancé for help." Charles's jaw tightened, and he looked away. "Eleanor was independent. She didn't like to be pressed. I thought she'd handle it herself." Miss Marple noted the evasiveness, the way his hands clenched at his sides. She thanked him and moved on, her thoughts turning to Mrs. Wentworth, whose financial dealings with Eleanor had already piqued her interest. She found the novelist in the library, seated at the scratched table, a pen moving swiftly across a notebook. "Mrs. Wentworth," Miss Marple said, settling opposite her, "I wonder if you might help me clarify something. You mentioned a publishing venture with Miss Vane, but I've heard she was under some financial strain. Could that have been related to your discussions?" Mrs. Wentworth's pen paused, and her eyes met Miss Marple's with a flicker of irritation. "Really, Miss Marple, you do have a knack for digging. Yes, Eleanor was reluctant to invest in my magazine, but it was hardly a matter of strain. She had her inheritance, you know, quite substantial, I believe. If she was short of funds, it wasn't because of me." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the novelist's defensiveness. A substantial inheritance. Yet Eleanor had refused Felix's loan and Mrs. Wentworth's investment. Was she guarding her money? Or was someone else draining it? The blackmail letters suggested a financial motive, and Miss Marple wondered if Mrs. Wentworth's ambition, or someone else's, might be at play. As evening approached, the manor grew quieter, the guests retreating to their rooms or gathering in tense silence. Miss Marple sat by the drawing-room fire, her knitting needles moving rhythmically, her thoughts a whirl of connections. Sylvia's emotional confession had opened a new door, revealing blackmail as a motive, but it also complicated the puzzle. The letters, the midnight meeting, the wax residue, the blue thread, the rose petal. They pointed to a calculated act, not a desperate suicide. Someone had exploited Eleanor's fear, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover who and why. She recalled the tiny photograph in the locket, the man's face blurred but suggestive. Could it be linked to the blackmailer, or was it a red herring, like Felix's bottle? The truth was close, she sensed, but it was buried beneath layers of lies, each guest hiding their own secrets. Sylvia's breakdown had been a turning point, but Miss Marple knew that more revelations were needed before the full picture could emerge. With her quiet persistence, she would continue to watch, to listen, to piece together the puzzle until the murderer's identity was laid bare. Chapter 9. The Trap. The fourth day at Blackthorn Manor dawned with a deceptive calm, the mist having lifted to reveal a pale sun that did little to warm the strained atmosphere within the house. The guests, weary from days of confinement and suspicion,
moved through the grand rooms with the guarded caution of those who sensed an unseen threat. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the drawing room with her knitting,
gathered a tapestry of clues: the wax residue, the blue silk thread, the rose petal, the broken locket, the blackmail letters, and now she felt the moment was ripe to apply pressure, to stir the pot and see what truths might rise to the surface. Inspector Harrow, still fixated on Felix Langston as the prime suspect, had spent the morning reviewing alibis and awaiting further laboratory results on the cyanide vial. Miss Marple, however, knew that the truth lay not in the obvious, but in the subtle contradictions of human behavior. Sylvia's emotional confession about the blackmail letters had been a turning point, revealing a motive that pointed to calculation rather than despair. Now Miss Marple decided it was time to bring the guests together to create a setting where nerves might fray and secrets might slip. At 3 p.m., with Lady Beatrice's consent, Miss Marple requested that everyone gather in the library, ostensibly to discuss the progress of the investigation. The inspector, though skeptical of her involvement, agreed to attend, curious to see what the unassuming old lady might uncover. The library, with its heavy oak table and shelves of leather-bound books, was an imposing stage, its atmosphere thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Miss Marple stood near the fireplace, her small figure commanding the room with a quiet authority that surprised even the most skeptical among them. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice gentle but clear. "I'm no detective, merely an old lady who has seen much of human nature. But I believe we are close to understanding what happened to poor Miss Vane, and I thought it might help to share our thoughts together." The guests seated around the table exchanged uneasy glances. Charles Haverford, his face drawn, sat beside Lady Beatrice, who clutched her handkerchief tightly. Sylvia Trent, still pale from a confession, avoided eye contact, her hands twisting in her lap. Colonel Bantry, his moustache bristling, sat ramrod straight, while Mrs. Clara Wentworth's pen hovered over her notebook, her eyes gleaming with curiosity. Dr. Hugh Grayson, ever reserved, adjusted his spectacles, and Felix Langston, looking haggard, slumped in his chair, his eyes darting nervously towards the inspector. Miss Marple began with a seemingly innocent observation. "It strikes me," she said, "that Miss Vane's death was no simple matter. The police believe it was suicide, prompted by a letter found on her desk, but there are other letters, are there not? Letters that threatened her, that demanded money to keep a secret from her past." A murmur rippled through the room. Sylvia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, while Charles's jaw tightened. Inspector Harrow's eyes narrowed, but he remained silent, allowing Miss Marple to continue. "Miss Trent," Miss Marple said, turning to Sylvia with a gentle smile, "you were kind enough to share that Miss Vane received such letters. You mentioned
A meeting at midnight, the night she died. I wonder, did anyone else know of this meeting?" Sylvia's face flushed, and she stammered, I told no one, Miss Marple. Eleanor swore me to secrecy." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes moving to Charles. "And you, Mr. Haverford, you mentioned an acquaintance bothering Eleanor. Did she ever speak of a midnight meeting? Or perhaps show you one of these letters?" Charles shifted uncomfortably, his charm faltering. "She didn't mention a meeting," he said, his voice tight. "As I told you, she spoke of an old acquaintance, nothing more. I thought it was trivial." Miss Marple's gaze was steady, her tone deceptively mild. "Yet it seems odd, does it not, that a woman so distressed would not confide in her fiancé, unless perhaps the secret involved you." The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Charles's face reddened, but before he could respond, Mrs. Wentworth spoke, her voice cool and measured. "Really, Miss Marple, you do have a flair for drama. If there were letters, surely they'd have been found by now. The police searched Eleanor's room thoroughly." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained serene. "Indeed, Mrs. Wentworth,
But I wonder about the library, where Miss Vane was seen with Miss Trent at 10:30 p.m. I found a curious detail there, a scratch on the table with a fragment of blue silk thread matching the gown Miss Vane wore that evening. And beside it, a trace of wax, as if a candle had been used. Mrs. Wentworth's pen froze, and Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of her lips. "Wax is common enough," the novelist said smoothly. "I often write by candlelight, as Lady Beatrice will confirm." "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed. "Yet the same wax was found in Miss Vane's room, near a small indentation on her desk. It suggests movement between the library and her room, late at night, when most of you claim to be asleep." Colonel Bantry cleared his throat, his voice gruff. "See here, Miss Marple, are you suggesting one of us was creeping about with a candle? Sounds like something out of one of Clara's novels." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not at all, Colonel. But small details matter. For instance, the rose petal found in Miss Vane's room, matching those in the hall vase. Someone plucked it, perhaps in passing, and carried it to her room. And the locket, broken, with a photograph inside. Whose face was it, I wonder?" Dr. Grayson, who had been silent, adjusted his spectacles nervously. "A locket?" he said, his voice low. "I don't recall Eleanor wearing one." "Yet it was there," Miss Marple said, her eyes meeting his. "And the letter on her desk. I know the truth now and I cannot bear it. What truth, I wonder? A secret worth blackmailing for, perhaps?" Felix Langston, unable, "Didn't touch her. Yes, I asked for money, but I didn't kill her. Someone planted that bottle in my room. I'd stake my life on it." Miss Marple's gaze softened, though her mind remained sharp. "I believe you, Mr. Langston. The evidence against you is convenient, is it not? Almost as if someone wished to divert attention." The room erupted in murmurs, the guests exchanging glances of suspicion and fear. Inspector Harrow, visibly annoyed, stepped forward. "Miss Marple, this is all very theatrical, but I must insist we stick to the facts. The bottle, the letter, Mr. Langston's motive are but part of the picture," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "The truth lies in the contradictions. The unlocked door when Mr. Haverford claimed it was locked. The wax suggesting movement. The thread placing Miss Vane in the library. Someone in this room knows more than they've said, and I believe they are close to revealing it." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment no one spoke. Sylvia's eyes filled with tears, and Charles's hands clenched into fists. Mrs. Wentworth's pen trembled, and Dr. Grayson's gaze dropped to the floor. Lady Beatrice, pale and trembling, whispered, "Oh, Miss Marple, what are we to do?" Miss Marple's smile was serene, but her eyes were steely. "We wait, Lady Beatrice. The truth has a way of coming to light when the right pressure is applied." As the gathering dispersed, the guests' nerves were visibly frayed, their masks slipping under Miss Marple's quiet scrutiny. She returned to her seat by the window, her knitting resumed, but her mind was alive with possibilities. The trap had been set, and she knew that someone, shaken by her words, would soon make a mistake. The blackmail letters, the wax, the thread, the locket, they were threads in a tapestry, and Miss Marple was determined to weave them into a pattern that revealed the murderer's identity. Chapter 10. The Reveal. The evening of the 4th day at Blackthorn Manor was heavy with anticipation, the air thick with the unspoken fears of its inhabitants. The grand library, its oak-panelled walls and towering bookshelves lit by the soft glow of electric lamps, was the stage for what Miss Jane Marple knew would be the climax of the drama. She had spent the day weaving together the threads of the mystery, the wax residue, the blue silk thread, the rose petal, the broken locket, the blackmail letters, and now, with the guests gathered at her request, she was ready to lay bare the truth. Her small, unassuming figure stood near the fireplace.
Grief and suspicion. Lady Beatrice, clutching her handkerchief, her eyes darting nervously. Sylvia Trent, pale and trembling. Colonel Bantry, his moustache bristling with impatience. Mrs. Clara Wentworth, her notebook closed, but her gaze sharp. Dr. Hugh Grayson, reserved as ever behind his spectacles, and Felix Langston, haggard and defiant, still under the inspector's scrutiny. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but commanding. "I am no detective, merely an old lady who has seen much of human nature. But I believe I have uncovered the truth about Miss Eleanor Vane's death, and I wish to share it with you, step by step, so that justice may be done." A murmur rippled through the room, but Miss Marple raised a hand for silence. "Let us begin with the facts. Miss Vane was found dead in her room, poisoned by cyanide, with a vial and a letter suggesting suicide. Yet certain details, the unlocked door, the wax residue, the blue silk thread, the rose petal, the broken locket, pointed to murder, carefully disguised. The letter on her desk, "I know the truth now and I cannot bear it," was not a suicide note, but a response to a threat, a blackmailer who knew a secret from her past. Sylvia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, while Charles's face paled. Miss Marple continued, her tone measured. Miss Trent revealed that Miss Vane was being blackmailed, receiving threatening letters demanding money to keep a secret. One such letter mentioned a meeting at midnight, the night she died. This meeting, I believe, took place in the library, where a scratch on the table and a fragment of blue silk thread matching Miss Vane's gown placed her after 10:30 p.m., when she was last seen with Miss Trent. Mrs. Wentworth's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room. The wax residue found both in the library and on Miss Vane's desk suggests someone moved between these places carrying a candle. Mrs. Wentworth, you are known to write by candlelight, but I believe the candle was used by another to conceal their movements in the dark. Mrs. Wentworth's pen trembled, but she remained silent. Miss Marple pressed on. The rose petal, matching those in the hall vase, was found in Miss Vane's room, suggesting someone passed through the hall. The broken locket, with its photograph of a man, hinted at a personal connection, a secret worth killing for. And the unlocked door, despite Mr. Haverford's claim that it was locked at 11 p.m., told me that someone entered her room after that time. Charles shifted uncomfortably, his hands clenching. Miss Marple's eyes met his, calm but unrelenting. Mr. flushed. But before he could speak, Miss Marple turned to Dr. Grayson. "Dr. Grayson, you treated Miss Vane for nerves and knew of her fears. You mentioned a letter that upset her, yet you did not press for details. I wonder if you suspected the truth, that her secret involved you." Dr. Grayson's spectacles glinted as he adjusted them, his voice steady. "I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple. I was her doctor, nothing more." Miss Marple's smile was serene, but her words were sharp. "I believe you were more than that, Dr. Grayson. The secret Miss Vane guarded was an affair, a brief, reckless liaison with you in London before her engagement to Mr. Haverford. The blackmailer discovered this and used it to extort money. But when Miss Vane refused to pay further
and threatened to expose the truth, you acted to silence her. A collective gasp filled the room. Dr. Grayson's face paled, and he rose, his hands trembling. "This is outrageous. I had no such relationship with Eleanor." Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "The evidence tells a different story. The wax residue places you in the library, where you met Miss Vane at midnight. The blue thread confirms her presence there. You followed her to her room, carrying a candle to avoid detection. The rose petal fell from your lapel, plucked from the hall vase as you passed. The cyanide, easily obtained by a physician, was administered there, and you staged the scene to look like suicide, leaving the vial and the letter. But you overlooked small details: the wax, the thread, the petal, and the locket, broken when Miss Vane struggled." Inspector Harrow, his skepticism fading, leaned forward. "Do you have proof, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple nodded. "The photograph in the locket, blurred but recognizable, matches Dr. Grayson's features. The maid, Mary, saw a shadow in the corridor near midnight, a man's shadow, not Felix's. And the wax residue matches the beeswax candles found in Dr. Grayson's room, not Mrs. Wentworth's. He planted the bottle in Mr. Langston's luggage to divert suspicion, knowing Felix's debts made him an easy target." Dr. Grayson's composure cracked, his voice rising. "This is absurd. You have no evidence, only conjecture." Miss Marple's eyes were steely. "The truth lies in the details, Dr. Grayson. You underestimated them, as you underestimated Miss Vane's resolve. She was prepared to confess her past to Charles to end the blackmail, and you could not allow that, not with your reputation at stake." The room was silent, the guests staring at Dr. Grayson.
Under arrest for the murder of Eleanor Vane. As the constable led him away, the room erupted in shocked murmurs. Lady Beatrice's handkerchief pressed to her lips, Sylvia sobbing openly, and Charles staring into space, his grief now tinged with betrayal. Miss Marple resumed her seat, her expression serene, but her heart heavy. The truth had been uncovered, but at a cost. The manor, once a place of celebration, was now a stage for tragedy, its secrets laid bare by the quiet persistence of an old lady who saw what others missed. Chapter 11. The Reflection. The morning following Dr. Grayson's arrest dawned clear and crisp, the Devon Hills bathed in a soft light that seemed to cleanse Blackthorn Manor of its recent shadows. The oppressive tension that had gripped the house for days had lifted, replaced by a somber quiet as the guests grappled with the truth of Eleanor Vane's murder. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the morning room with a cup of tea and a knitting, appeared as serene as ever, her needles clicking softly in the stillness. Yet her mind, ever active, was reflecting on the intricate tapestry of human nature that had unraveled before her, revealing both its beauty and its darkness. The police had departed with Dr. Grayson in custody, and Inspector Harrow, though initially skeptical of Miss Marple's methods, had offered a grudging nod of respect as he left. The guests, still reeling from the revelation, had gathered in the drawing room to discuss their plans, some preparing to leave the manor now that the investigation was concluded. Miss Marple, however, had chosen to linger a little longer, at Lady Beatrice's insistence, to provide comfort and perhaps to offer a final perspective on the tragedy that had unfolded. Lady Beatrice found her shortly after breakfast, her face pale but composed. "Miss Marple," she said, settling beside her, "I cannot thank you enough. Without your insight, poor Felix might have been wrongly accused, and the truth about Eleanor's death would have remained hidden.
But I confess, I'm still at a loss. How did you see what we all missed? Miss Marple smiled gently, setting her knitting aside. My dear Lady Beatrice, I have no special gift, only the habit of observing people. In my little village of St. Mary Mead, I have seen many dramas, small and great, and I have learned that human nature is much the same, whether in a cottage or a manor. People hide their secrets, but they leave traces, small things, like a rose petal or a fragment of thread, that tell a story if one listens. Lady Beatrice nodded, her eyes filling with tears. But Dr. Grayson, he seemed so kind, so professional. To think he could do such a thing. Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. People are complex.
Threat he could not bear. It is a sad truth that kindness can mask desperation, and desperation can lead to terrible acts. She paused, her gaze drifting to the window, where the garden bloomed with quiet resilience. The clues were there, you see, the wax residue, suggesting movement in the night, the blue silk thread, placing Eleanor in the library, the rose petal carried from the hall, the broken locket, with its photograph of Dr. Grayson. There were small things, but they spoke of a truth that contradicted the alibis given. And the blackmail letters, revealed by Miss Trent's courage, pointed to a motive that was both personal and calculated. Lady Beatrice shook her head, her voice trembling. And poor Eleanor! To think she was so tormented, and none of us knew. Miss Marple's eyes softened. She was a young woman with a secret, as many are, but she was brave in her way, determined to face her blackmailer and end the threat. That courage, sadly, was her undoing, for Dr. Grayson saw no other way to protect himself. It is a lesson, perhaps, that secrets, when hidden too long, can become dangerous. As they spoke, Charles Haverford entered, his face drawn but resolute. He approached Miss Marple, his voice low. I owe you an apology, Miss Marple. I was less than forthcoming about Eleanor's troubles. I knew of the letters, but I thought I could protect her by keeping silent. If I'd spoken sooner, perhaps... Miss Marple's gaze was kind but firm. Do not blame yourself, Mr. Haverford. You loved her, and love can blind us to the truth. But you must learn from this. Honesty, however painful, is often the better path. Charles nodded, his eyes glistening, and excused himself. Miss Marple watched him go, her thoughts turning to Sylvia Trent, whose emotional confession had been the key to unlocking the mystery. Sylvia had been brave too, in her own way, and Miss Marple hoped she would find peace in time. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a final walk through the garden, the air fragrant with the scent of roses. She paused by the hedge where she had seen the cigarette ash days before, a detail that had seemed insignificant, but had sparked her curiosity. It was not a clue in the end, but it had reminded her to look beyond the obvious, to seek the small truths that others overlooked. Returning to the house, she found Mrs. Clara Wentworth in the library, her notebook open but her pen idle. The novelist's sharp eyes met Miss Marple's, and she smiled faintly. You've quite upstaged me, Miss Marple, she said. I thought I knew how to unravel a mystery, but you've shown me otherwise. Miss Marple chuckled softly. You write of human nature, Mrs. Wentworth, and you see much, but sometimes the truth requires a simpler lens, one that looks for the ordinary in the extraordinary. Your novels will be all the richer for it, I think.
Perhaps you're right. I shall dedicate my next book to you if you don't mind. Miss Marple smiled, demurring, and made her way to the hall, where her small suitcase waited. Colonel Bantry, passing by, offered a gruff nod. Damned fine work, Miss Marple, he said. Didn't think you had it in you, but you've put us all to shame. You are too kind, Colonel, Miss Marple replied, her eyes twinkling. I only did what anyone might, with a little patience and observation. As she prepared to leave, Lady Beatrice pressed her hand warmly. You must come back, Miss Marple, when we are not overshadowed by tragedy. Blackthorn Manor will always welcome you. Miss Marple nodded, her heart warmed by the gesture, but her mind already turning to the quiet simplicity of St. Mary Mead. "I shall, Lady Beatrice, but for now I think my roses need tending, and my village has its own little mysteries to solve." With a final farewell, Miss Marple stepped into the waiting car, the manor receding behind her as the Devon hills unfolded in the distance. She reflected on the case, on the frailty of human nature and the power of small things to reveal great truths. Dr. Grayson's desperation, Eleanor's courage, Sylvia's confession, Charles's regret, they were all part of the human tapestry, woven with threads of love, fear, and ambition. Miss Marple knew that such threads would weave new patterns in time, in other places, and she would be there, with her knitting and her quiet wisdom, to unravel them. As the car wound through the countryside, she opened her knitting bag, her fingers brushing against a small pressed rose petal she had kept as a memento, not of the crime, but of the lesson it had taught her. Human nature, she thought, was both the puzzle and the solution, and it was her privilege to understand it, one delicate clue at a time. Chapter 12. A Shadow Lingers. The train to St. Mary Mead chugged steadily through the Devon countryside, its rhythmic clatter a soothing counterpoint to the quiet reflections of Miss Jane Marple, who sat by the window with her knitting in her lap. The events at Blackthorn Manor had left their mark, not only on the guests, but on her own perceptive mind, which continued to sift through the details of Eleanor Vane's murder, even as the manor faded into memory. Dr. Grayson's confession had resolved the primary mystery, but Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of unravelling village intrigues, whispered that a shadow still lingered. A loose thread in the tapestry of Blackthorn Manor that demanded her attention. Her thoughts were interrupted by a telegram, delivered by the conductor just as the train paused at a small station. It was from Lady Beatrice, brief but urgent. "Miss Marple, please return. A troubling discovery. Your insight needed." Miss Marple's lips pursed thoughtfully, her fingers pausing on her needles. She had planned to tend her roses and enjoy the quiet of
Mead, but duty, and perhaps curiosity, called her back. She sent a reply, promising to return to Blackthorn Manor by evening, and settled back, her mind already turning over possibilities. By 6 p.m, Miss Marple was once again in the grand hall of Blackthorn Manor, greeted by a visibly shaken Lady Beatrice. The other guests, Charles Haverford, Sylvia Trent, Colonel Bantry, Mrs. Clara Wentworth, and Felix Langston, were still present, their departure delayed by the lingering police presence and their own reluctance to leave the scene of such tragedy. Inspector Harrow, too, had returned, his expression one of exasperation as he stood in the drawing-room holding a small, leather-bound notebook. "Miss Marple," Lady Beatrice said, her voice trembling, "we found this in Eleanor's room, hidden in a secret compartment in her jewellery box. It wasn't discovered during the initial search, but one of the maids noticed the compartment this morning. It changes things." Miss Marple took the notebook, her fingers brushing the worn leather. It was small, no larger than a diary, and its pages were filled with Eleanor's neat, flowing script. She opened it to a marked page, dated a week before the murder, and read silently. "I know who he is now. The letters are not from a stranger, but from someone here, someone I trusted. I must confront him, or this will never end." The entry was cryptic, but it confirmed Sylvia's story of blackmail and hinted at a deeper betrayal. Inspector Harrow cleared his throat. "It's troubling, I'll grant you," he said, "but Dr. Grayson confessed. The case is closed. This notebook might refer to him, nothing more." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained mild. "Perhaps, Inspector, but it raises questions. If Dr. Grayson was the blackmailer, why did Eleanor write of confronting someone I trusted? Her affair with him was a secret,
not a bond of trust. I wonder if there is more to this than we've seen." The guests gathered in the drawing room exchanged uneasy glances. Charles, his face drawn, spoke first. "This is nonsense. Eleanor's death is solved. Why drag it out?" Miss Marple's gaze was gentle but probing. "Because, Mr. Haverford, truth is like a garden. It requires tending even after the weeds are pulled. This notebook suggests another hand in the blackmail, perhaps someone who knew of Dr. Grayson's secret and used it to their advantage." Sylvia, pale and trembling, clutched her handkerchief. "But who? We've all been questioned, scrutinized. There's no one else." Miss Marple's eyes moved to Mrs. Wentworth, whose pen was idle for once, her expression guarded. "Mrs. Wentworth," she said softly, "you are a keen observer of human nature. Did you ever notice Eleanor writing in this notebook, perhaps in the library?" Mrs. Wentworth:
"Writers notice such things, Miss Marple, but I didn't pry." Miss Marple nodded, her mind recalling the wax residue and the scratched table in the library. She turned to Felix, who sat slumped in a corner, his eyes bloodshot.
"Mr. Langston, you were desperate for money. Did you ever suspect Eleanor was hiding something valuable, perhaps in her room?"
Felix's face flushed. "I told you, I only asked her for a loan. I didn't know about any notebook or secrets. I'm no blackmailer." Miss Marple's smile was serene, but her thoughts were sharp. The notebook's discovery suggested a second layer to the mystery, a blackmailer who had manipulated Dr. Grayson's actions, perhaps planting the bottle in Felix's luggage to divert suspicion. She requested to examine Eleanor's room again, and Lady Beatrice, eager for answers, agreed. In the quiet of Eleanor's room, Miss Marple studied the jewelry box, its secret compartment cleverly hidden behind a false panel. The notebook's pages revealed more. Cryptic references to "the watcher in the shadows" and "a debt repaid in silence." One entry, dated 2 days before her death, read,
"He knows too much, and he's here watching. I must act before it's too late."
The handwriting trembled, betraying Eleanor's fear. Miss Marple's gaze fell on the desk, where the half-finished letter had been found. She noticed a faint indentation in the blotter, as if another letter had been written and removed. Kneeling, she examined the floor and found a tiny scrap of paper, overlooked by the police, caught beneath the desk's leg. It bore a single typed word: midnight. This, she realized, was a fragment of the blackmail letter Eleanor had shown Sylvia, discarded or hidden in haste. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple gathered the guests once more, her presence commanding, despite her unassuming demeanor.
"This notebook," she said, holding it aloft, "suggests that Dr. Grayson was not the only one involved. Someone else knew Eleanor's secret and used it to extort her, perhaps manipulating Dr. Grayson into acting. The typed fragment I found confirms a blackmail letter, and its presence in this house points to someone among us."
Colonel Bantry bristled.
"This is absurd."
Grayson confessed. "You're spinning tales, Miss Marple." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled.
"Not tales, Colonel, but truths. The wax residue, the blue thread, the rose petal. They told one story, but this notebook tells another. Someone typed those letters, someone who had access to a typewriter. Mrs. Wentworth, you have one in your room, do you not?"
Mrs. Wentworth's face paled, but her voice was steady.
"I do, but so do many writers. Are you accusing me, Miss Marple?" "Not yet," Miss Marple said gently, "but I wonder about the timing. The letters began weeks ago, before Dr. Grayson's desperation peaked. Someone else had a motive.
Haverford, you knew of the letters? Did you ever see them typed? Charles's jaw tightened. I told you Eleanor mentioned an acquaintance, nothing more. I never saw the letters. Miss Marple nodded, her mind piecing together the final threads. The typewriter, the notebook, the typed fragment. They pointed to a second conspirator, someone who had orchestrated the blackmail and perhaps pushed Dr. Grayson to act. She resolved to examine Mrs. Wentworth's typewriter later, suspecting it might hold the key to the final truth. As the guests dispersed, their nerves frayed, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting resumed. The shadow of Blackthorn Manor's secrets lingered, but she was confident that one more revelation would bring clarity. Human nature, she reflected, was a puzzle of motives and masks, and she would unravel this final piece with her quiet, persistent wisdom. In Story and Prac, a shadow lingers. The train to St. Mary Mead chugged steadily through the Devon countryside, its rhythmic clatter a soothing counterpoint to the quiet reflections of Miss Jane Marple, who sat by the window with her knitting in her lap. The events at Blackthorn Manor had left their mark, not only on the guests but on her own perceptive mind, which continued to sift through the details of Eleanor Vane's murder, even as the manor faded into memory. Dr. Grayson's confession had resolved the primary mystery, but Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of unraveling village intrigues, whispered that a shadow still lingered, a loose thread in the tapestry of Blackthorn Manor that demanded her attention. Her thoughts were interrupted by a telegram, delivered by the conductor just as the train paused at a small station. It was from Lady Beatrice, brief but urgent. "Miss Marple, please return. A troubling discovery. Your insight needed." Miss Marple's lips pursed thoughtfully, her fingers pausing on her needles. She had planned to tend her roses and enjoy the quiet of St. Mary Mead, but duty, and perhaps curiosity, called her back. She sent a reply, promising to return to Blackthorn Manor by evening, and settled back, her mind already turning over possibilities. By 6 p.m., Miss Marple was once again in the grand hall of Blackthorn Manor, greeted by a visibly shaken Lady Beatrice. The other guests, Charles Haverford, Sylvia Trent, Colonel Bantry, Mrs. Clara Wentworth, and Felix Langston, were still present, their departure delayed by the lingering police presence and their own reluctance to leave the scene of such tragedy. Inspector Harrow, too, had returned, his expression one of exasperation as he stood in the drawing-room, holding a small leather-bound notebook. "Miss Marple," Lady Beatrice said, her voice trembling, "we found this in Eleanor's room, hidden in a secret compartment in her jewelry box. It wasn't discovered during the initial search, but one of the maids noticed the compartment this morning. Marple took the notebook, her fingers brushing the worn leather. It was small, no larger than a diary, and its pages were filled with Eleanor's neat, flowing script. She opened it to a marked page, dated a week before the murder, and read silently. "I know who he is now. The letters are not from a stranger, but from someone here, someone I trusted. I must confront him or this will never end." The entry was cryptic, but it confirmed Sylvia's story of blackmail and hinted at a deeper betrayal. Inspector Harrow cleared his throat. "It's troubling, I'll grant you," he said. "But Dr. Grayson confessed. The case is closed. This notebook might refer to him, nothing more." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained mild. "Perhaps, Inspector, but it raises questions. If Dr. Grayson was the blackmailer, why did Eleanor write of confronting someone I trusted? Her affair with him was a secret, not a bond of trust. I wonder if there is more to this than we've seen." The guests, gathered in the drawing-room, exchanged uneasy glances. Charles, his face drawn, spoke first. "This is nonsense. Eleanor's death is solved. Why drag it out?" Miss Marple's gaze was gentle but probing. "Because, Mr. Haverford, truth is like a garden. It requires tending even after the weeds are pulled. This notebook suggests another hand in the blackmail. Perhaps someone who knew of Dr. Grayson's secret and used it to their advantage." Sylvia, pale and trembling, clutched her handkerchief.
But who? We've all been questioned, scrutinized. There's no one else.
Miss Marple's eyes moved to Mrs. Wentworth, whose pen was idle for once, her expression guarded.
Mrs. Wentworth, she said softly, you are a keen observer of human nature. Did you ever notice Eleanor writing in this notebook, perhaps in the library?
Mrs. Wentworth's lips tightened.
I saw her with a notebook once or twice, yes, but I thought it was a diary. Writers notice such things, Miss Marple, but I didn't pry.
Miss Marple nodded, her mind recalling the wax residue and the scratch table in the library.
She turned to Felix, who sat slumped in a corner, his eyes bloodshot. Mr. Langston, you were desperate for money. Did you ever suspect Eleanor was hiding something valuable, perhaps in her room?
Felix's face flushed.
I told you, I only asked her for a loan. I didn't know about any notebook or secrets. I'm no blackmailer. Miss Marple's smile was serene, but her thoughts were sharp. The notebook's discovery suggested a notebook's pages revealed more. Cryptic references to the Watcher in the Shadows and a debt repaid in silence. One entry, dated 2 days before her death, read, "He knows too much, and he's here, watching. I must act before it's too late." The handwriting trembled, betraying Eleanor's fear. Miss Marple's gaze fell on the desk, where the half-finished letter had been found. She noticed a faint indentation in the blotter, as if another letter had been written and removed. Kneeling, she examined the floor and found a tiny scrap of paper, overlooked by the police, caught beneath the desk's leg. It bore a single typed word, midnight. This, she realized, was a fragment of the blackmail letter Eleanor had shown Sylvia, discarded or hidden in haste. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple gathered the guests once more, her presence commanding despite her unassuming demeanor. "This notebook," she said, holding it aloft, "suggests that Dr. Grayson was not the only one involved. Someone else knew Eleanor's secret and used it to extort her, perhaps manipulating Dr. Grayson into acting. The typed fragment I found confirms a blackmail letter, and its presence in this house points to someone among us." Colonel Bantry bristled. "This is absurd. Grayson confessed. You're spinning tales, Miss Marple." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Not tales, Colonel, but truths. The wax residue, the blue thread, the rose petal, they told one story. But this notebook tells another. Someone typed those letters, someone who had access to a typewriter. Mrs. Wentworth, you have one in your room, do you not?" Mrs. Wentworth's face paled, but her voice was steady. "I do, but so do many writers. Are you accusing me, Miss Marple?" "Not yet," Miss Marple said gently. "But I wonder about the timing. The letters began weeks ago, before Dr. Grayson's desperation peaked. Someone else had a motive, perhaps financial, perhaps personal. Mr. Haverford, you knew of the letters. Did you ever see them typed?" Charles's jaw tightened. "I told you. Eleanor mentioned an acquaintance, nothing more. I never saw the letters." Miss Marple nodded, her mind piecing together the final threads. The typewriter, the notebook, the typed fragment pointed to a second conspirator, someone who had orchestrated the blackmail and perhaps pushed Dr. Grayson to act. She resolved to examine Mrs. Wentworth's typewriter later, suspecting it might hold the key to the final truth. As the guests dispersed, their nerves frayed, Miss Marple sat by the window. Her knitting resumed. The shadow of Blackthorn Manor's secrets lingered, but she was confident
that one more revelation would bring clarity.
Stirred the curtains and carried the faint scent of roses through the open windows. The house, though quieter now that Dr. Grayson's arrest had resolved the primary mystery of Eleanor Vane's murder, remained steeped in an undercurrent of unease. The discovery of Eleanor's notebook, with its cryptic references to a blackmailer among the guests, had cast a new shadow, and Miss Jane Marple, seated in the morning room with her knitting, was determined to unravel this final thread. Her needles clicked softly, a steady rhythm that belied the sharp workings of her mind as she pieced together the clues. The typed fragment, the wax residue, the notebook's hidden entries that suggested a hidden hand behind the tragedy. Lady Beatrice, still shaken by the notebook's revelations, had urged Miss Marple to stay another day, and Miss Marple, sensing that the truth was close, had agreed. Inspector Harrow, though skeptical of the need for further investigation, had returned to the manor to oversee the collection of additional evidence, his patience with Miss Marple's methods wearing thin. Yet Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, knew that the notebook's entries pointed to a second conspirator, someone who had manipulated Dr. Grayson's desperation and orchestrated the blackmail scheme that led to Eleanor's death. Her first task was to examine Mrs. Clara Wentworth's typewriter, which she suspected might have produced the blackmail letters. With Lady Beatrice's permission, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Wentworth's room under the pretense of borrowing a book. The novelist was out, walking in the garden, and the room was tidy, with a portable typewriter on a small desk by the window. Miss Marple, with the dexterity of one accustomed to delicate tasks, inserted a sheet of paper and typed a few words, noting the alignment of the letters. The T was slightly misaligned, a faint quirk that matched the typed fragment she had found in Eleanor's room. It was not definitive proof, but it was a significant clue, one that placed Mrs. Wentworth at the heart of the mystery. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple found Sylvia Trent, whose emotional confession had been the key to uncovering Dr. Grayson's guilt. Sylvia was pale, her eyes shadowed with grief, but she greeted Miss Marple with a tentative smile. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low, "have you found anything more? About the notebook, I mean." Miss Marple's expression was gentle but probing. "I am beginning to, my dear. The notebook suggests that Eleanor knew her blackmailer was someone close, someone she trusted. You mentioned her fear, her determination to confront this person. Did she ever hint at who it might be? Perhaps a name or a detail?" Sylvia hesitated, her fingers twisting her handkerchief. "She didn't name anyone, but she said something odd."
The notebook. I thought she was being dramatic, but now I wonder if she meant someone specific, someone who was always watching her. Miss Marple nodded, her mind recalling Mrs. Wentworth's sharp, observant eyes and her habit of scribbling notes. "And did you ever see her with Mrs. Wentworth, perhaps in a private conversation?" Sylvia frowned, thinking. "Once, in London, at a literary salon. They were talking quietly, and Eleanor seemed upset. I didn't catch much, but I heard Clara mention something about knowing too much. I thought it was about her novels, but now—" This was a thread worth pursuing, and Miss Marple thanked Sylvia, her thoughts turning to the novelist's guarded demeanor. She sought out Mrs. Wentworth in the garden, where the novelist was sketching a rose bush, her pencil moving with practiced precision. "Mrs. Wentworth," Miss Marple said, her tone light, "I do admire your eye for detail. It must serve you well in your writing and in observing those around you." Mrs. Wentworth's smile was tight. "You're very kind, Miss Marple, but I suspect you're here for more than compliments. What do you want to know?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Only a small thing. I understand you and Miss Vane discussed a publishing venture, but Sylvia
mentioned seeing you together in London in a heated conversation. Something about knowing too much. Might that have been related to the letters Eleanor received?" Mrs. Wentworth's pencil paused, and for a moment her composure faltered. "You do have a knack for digging, Miss Marple. Yes, I spoke with Eleanor at a salon. She was indiscreet about her past, and I warned her that such things could be dangerous in the wrong hands. But I assure you, I had no part in any letters." Miss Marple nodded, noting the slight tremor in the novelist's voice. She excused herself and made her way to the library, where she examined the scratched table once more. The wax residue and blue silk thread had been crucial in solving Eleanor's murder, but now she noticed something new. A faint smudge of ink near the scratch, similar to the smudge on Mrs. Wentworth's cuff at dinner. It suggested that the novelist had been at the table, perhaps typing or handling papers, on the night of the murder. Her next stop was Felix Langston, who was in the billiard room, idly rolling a cue ball. His haggard appearance had softened slightly. The weight of suspicion lifted, but he remained uneasy. "Mr. Langston," Miss Marple said gently, "you were in the library briefly on the night of Eleanor's death. Did you notice anything unusual, perhaps Mrs. Wentworth or a typewriter?" Felix frowned, his brow furrowing. "I didn't see Clara, but I did hear something, a faint tapping like typing, when I passed the library door around 11 p.m. I thought it was odd, since everyone was supposed to be in their rooms." This was significant. Tapping suggested that the blackmail letter might have been typed that night, perhaps after Eleanor's meeting with Dr. Grayson. She thanked Felix and returned to the drawing room, where the guests were gathering for tea, the conversation subdued. As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting resumed, her thoughts a whirl of connections. The misaligned T on Mrs. Wentworth's typewriter, the ink smudge, the tapping Felix heard, they pointed to the novelist as the blackmailer, using her knowledge of Eleanor's affair with Dr. Grayson to extort money and perhaps to push him into murder. Her motive, Miss Marple suspected, was financial. A publishing venture needed funds, and Eleanor's inheritance was a tempting target. Something change means share her findings about the typewriter and the ink smudge. Reluctantly, he agreed to search Mrs. Wentworth's room again, and there, hidden in a drawer, they found a draft of a typed letter, its wording matching the fragments Miss Marple had found. "Pay, or the truth will be told." The T was misaligned, just as she had predicted. Confronted with the evidence, Mrs. Wentworth's composure cracked, and she admitted to writing the letters, hoping to secure funds for her magazine. "I never meant for her to die," she whispered, a voice breaking. "I only wanted the money. Grayson, he took it too far." Miss Marple, a heart heavy, watched as the inspector led Mrs. Wentworth away. The shadow had lifted, but the truth had left its mark on Blackthorn Manor. As she prepared to leave once more, Miss Marple reflected that human greed and fear were ever present, but so too was the power of observation to bring justice. Chapter 14. The Final Threads. The sixth morning at Blackthorn Manor broke with a serene clarity. The Devon hills bathed in a golden light that seemed to promise renewal after the storm of revelations. The arrests of Dr. Hugh Grayson and Mrs. Clara Wentworth had lifted the oppressive shadow that had hung over the house. Yet a quiet melancholy lingered, as if the manor itself mourned the betrayal of trust within its walls. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the conservatory with her knitting, observed the remaining guests with her usual gentle attentiveness, the needles clicking in a rhythm that steadied her thoughts. The mystery of Eleanor Vane's death had been solved, and the blackmail scheme that fueled it exposed. But Miss Marple's keen instincts told her that a few delicate threads remained, waiting to be woven into the tapestry of truth. Lady Beatrice, though relieved that justice had been served, was visibly shaken.
a kind heart struggling to reconcile the deceit of those she had welcomed as friends. Charles Haverford, Sylvia Trent, Colonel Bantry, and Felix Langston, now free to leave, lingered in the manor, the departure delayed
by a shared need to process the events. Inspector Harrow had returned to the village to finalize his reports, leaving Miss Marple to offer her quiet wisdom to those left behind. She sensed that the emotional undercurrents of the case, grief, guilt, and unspoken regrets, needed resolution before the manor could truly heal. Her opportunity came at mid-morning when Sylvia Trent sought her out, her face pale but resolute. "Miss Marple," Sylvia said, settling beside her, "I can't thank you enough for what you've done, but I feel responsible somehow. If I'd told someone about Eleanor's blackmail sooner, perhaps she'd still be alive." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her eyes kind but searching. "My dear, you must not carry that burden. You acted out of loyalty, and your courage in speaking out helped uncover the truth. Eleanor's choices and those of others led to her fate, not your silence." Sylvia's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "There's something else," she said hesitantly. "I found this in my room this morning, tucked into my book of poetry. I think Eleanor left it there before everything." She handed Miss Marple a small, folded note, its edges worn but its handwriting unmistakably Eleanor's. It read, "Sylvia, if anything happens to me, trust your heart. You are always my truest friend." Miss Marple's heart softened at the words, but her mind sharpened. The note was a final clue, not to the murder, but to Eleanor's state of mind, a testament to her trust in Sylvia and perhaps a hint at her fear of betrayal. "This is important, Miss Trent," Miss Marple said gently. "It shows Eleanor's faith in you, and it reminds us that even in her fear, she had hope. Keep it close and let it guide you forward." Sylvia nodded, clutching the note, and excused herself, her step lighter than before. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Charles Haverford, whose grief had been complicated by the revelation of Eleanor's affair with Dr. Grayson. She found him in the garden, staring at the rose bush where the petal found in Eleanor's room had likely originated. "Mr. Haverford," she said, approaching with her usual gentle demeanor, "I sense you are still troubled. Might I offer a word of comfort?" Charles turned, his face etched with sorrow. "Miss Marple, I loved Eleanor, but I failed her. I knew she was worried, but I didn't press her. And now to learn of her involvement with Grayson." His voice broke, and he looked away. Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "Love is not diminished by mistakes, Mr. Haverford. Eleanor's past did not define her, nor does it define what you shared. You must forgive her and yourself to find peace." Charles nodded, his jaw tightening. "There's something I haven't told anyone," he said suddenly. "The night she died, I saw her in the hall, near the vase of roses, around 10:45 p.m. She was holding a petal, twisting it in her fingers. I asked what was wrong, but she just smiled and said she'd tell me later. I should have stayed with her." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her expression remained calm. This confirmed the rose petal's origin and placed Eleanor in the hall just before her meeting in the library. It was a small detail, but it completed the timeline, tying the petal to her final moments. "You've done well to tell me," she said. "It helps us understand her last hours, and it shows she trusted you even then." As Charles returned to the house, Miss Marple lingered in the garden, her thoughts turning to Felix Langston. His exoneration had lifted a weight, but his reckless past still cast a shadow. She found him in the billiard room, his demeanor less haggard, but still uneasy. "Mr. Langston," she said, her tone gentle, "you've been through a great ordeal. I wonder if there's anything more you wish to share now that the truth is out." Felix hesitated, then sighed. "I suppose I owe you that much, Miss Marple. I didn't tell the whole truth about my argument with Eleanor. It wasn't just about a loan. She knew about my gambling debts, knew the man I owed was dangerous. She warned me to stop,
said she'd tell Lady Beatrice if I didn't. I was angry, but I didn't hate her. She was trying to help. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing this final piece. Eleanor's concern for Felix explained her guardedness, and it suggested why Mrs. Wentworth had targeted her. Eleanor's inheritance was a tempting prize, and her moral stance made her a threat. "You've done right to tell me," she said. "Honesty, even late, is a step toward redemption." That afternoon, Miss Marple joined Lady Beatrice for tea, the two women sharing a quiet moment in the drawing room. "Miss Marple," Lady Beatrice said, her voice steady but emotional, "you've brought light to our darkness, but I fear this house will never feel the same." Miss Marple's smile was warm. "Houses, like people, carry their scars, Lady Beatrice, but they also carry strength. You welcomed Eleanor with kindness, and that kindness will endure. Let Blackthorn Manor be a place of healing now." As the day drew to a close, Miss Marple took a final walk through the manor, her eyes lingering on the hall vase, the library table, the quiet corners where secrets had been whispered. The clues, the wax, the thread, the petal, the locket, the notebook, had told a story of betrayal, but also of courage and trust. Eleanor's note to Sylvia, Charles's confession, Felix's honesty, they were the final threads, weaving a tapestry of human resilience. With her suitcase packed, Miss Marple prepared to leave, her heart light but her
Ivy-clad walls glowing in the fading light. Human nature, she thought, was a puzzle of light and shadow, and it was her privilege to illuminate it, one delicate clue at a time. The train from Devon to St. Mary Mead wound its way through the rolling English countryside, its gentle sway a comforting rhythm that matched the quiet contentment in Miss Jane Marple's heart. She sat by the window, her knitting bag at her side, her needles idle for once, as she gazed at the patchwork of fields and hedgerows passing by. The events at Blackthorn Manor, Eleanor Vane's murder, Dr. Grayson's desperate act, Mrs. Wentworth's blackmail scheme had left their mark, but they had also reaffirmed her faith in the power of observation, the delicate art of seeing what others overlooked. As the train neared her village, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to home, to the familiar routines that awaited her, and to the small, everyday mysteries that were no less compelling than those of a grand manor. The resolution of the Blackthorn case had been both satisfying and sobering. Dr. Grayson's confession had unveiled a tragedy born of fear and ambition, while Mrs. Wentworth's exposure as the blackmailer had revealed the greed that lurked beneath her polished exterior. The notebook, the wax residue, the blue silk thread, the rose petal, the locket, the typed fragment, these clues had woven a tapestry of truth, and Miss Marple had been the quiet weaver, her unassuming presence the key to unraveling it. Yet it was the human moments, Sylvia's courage, Charles's regret, Felix's belated honesty, that lingered most in her mind, reminding her that justice, though necessary, was often tinged with sorrow. As the train pulled into St. Mary Mead's modest station, Miss Marple gathered her things, her small suitcase and knitting bag, a familiar weight in her hands. The platform was quiet, save for the cheerful greeting of young Tommy, the station boy who tipped his cap and offered to carry her bag. "Welcome back, Miss Marple," he said, his grin wide. "Heard you've been solving mysteries again. Village hasn't been the same without you." Miss Marple chuckled softly, her eyes twinkling. "Nonsense, Tommy. I'm sure St. Mary Mead has managed perfectly well. But I'm glad to be home." The walk to her cottage was a short one, the familiar lanes lined with honeysuckle and the distant hum of village life, children playing, the clatter of a milk cart,
the murmur of gossip from the post office, her garden, tended faithfully by her neighbour Mrs. Price in her absence, greeted her with a riot of roses, their petals a vivid reminder of the clue that had helped solve Eleanor's murder. Miss Marple paused to admire them, her fingers brushing a soft pink bloom, and reflected that nature, like human nature, held its own.
Marple settled into her favourite armchair, a cup of tea steaming beside her. Her knitting resumed, the familiar click of the needles a soothing counterpoint to her thoughts. The Blackthorn case had been complex, a puzzle of motives and masks, but it had also been a mirror of the small dramas she encountered in St. Mary Mead. Greed, fear, love, betrayal, these were universal, whether in a grand manor or a village shop, and Miss Marple's gift was in seeing them clearly, without judgment, but with a quiet resolve to bring light to the shadows. Her reverie was interrupted by a knock at the door, and she rose to find Mrs. Hartnell, the village busybody, standing on the step, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Miss Marple," she exclaimed, bustling inside, "you must tell me everything. The vicar says you solved a murder in Devon. Something about a doctor and a writer. Is it true?" Miss Marple smiled, ushering her guest to a seat. "Now, Mrs. Hartnell, you know I don't care for gossip, but I'll tell you what I can. It was a sad affair, but the truth came out, as it always does when one pays attention." Mrs. Hartnell leaned forward, her teacup forgotten. "But how do you do it, Miss Marple? I mean, you're just, well, you're like any of us, knitting and gardening, yet you see things the police miss." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained modest. "It's only a matter of looking, Mrs. Hartnell. People are much the same everywhere, village or manor. They leave traces of their hearts in the smallest things. A word, a glance, a petal dropped in haste. In St. Mary Mead, I've seen it in the way Mrs. Finch fusses over her roses when she's cross with her husband, or how young Billy hides his sweets when he's been naughty. It's no different, really, from a manor full of secrets." Mrs. Hartnell nodded, though her expression suggested she didn't quite grasp the simplicity of it. "Well, you're a marvel, Miss Marple, but there's something here you might want to know about. Mrs. Price says her nephew's been acting odd, sneaking about at night, and there's talk of missing letters from the post office. I thought you might—" Miss Marple raised a hand, her smile gentle but firm. "One mystery at a time, Mrs. Hartnell. Let me settle in, and then we'll see about young Tommy Price. It's likely nothing more than a boy's mischief, but I'll keep an eye out." Mrs. Hartnell, satisfied with the promise of future intrigue, finished her tea and bustled off, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. She returned to her armchair, her knitting resumed, and let her mind wander back to Blackthorn Manor. The rose petal, she mused, had been the smallest clue, yet it had led her to the truth, connecting Eleanor's final moments to the hall vase and the murderer's path. It was a reminder that the smallest things could hold the greatest significance, a lesson she carried from every case. As evening fell, Miss Marple took a final walk through her garden, the stars beginning to twinkle above. She paused by her roses, her fingers brushing the petals, and thought of Eleanor Vane, her courage, her secrets, her tragic end. The Blackthorn case had been a stark reminder of the fragility of trust, but also of the strength of truth, however painful. Sylvia's note, Charles's confession, Felix's honesty, they had been the human threads that completed the tapestry. And Miss Marple felt a quiet pride in having helped them find their way. Returning inside, she lit a lamp and opened her knitting bag, where the pressed rose petal from Blackthorn Manor lay tucked in a small envelope. It was a memento not of the crime, but of the lesson it had taught her, that human nature, with all its flaws and virtues, was a puzzle worth solving. As she settled into her chair, her needles clicking once more, Miss Marple felt a familiar spark of curiosity. St. Mary Mead, with its own small dramas, awaited her, and she was ready to meet them with her quiet wisdom, her sharp eyes
and our unerring faith in the power of the truth.